Hey guys, welcome to the opening series of the Budapest Gambit. It normally goes against the variation of d4, so we are trying to create a repertoire against d4 variation. So let's see how it goes. So when white plays d4, normally what we do is try to control the light squares, since white already controls the dark squares, the e5 square and the c5 square. So how do we control the light squares? We could play d5, or we could play nf6. nf6 is a pretty good move because nf6 is not only against the dark square control, but it's also controlling the light squares e4 and d5. So it's a pretty solid move against the d4 variation. So normally white plays something like c4 to control the d5 square now. And here, instead of going with the normal variations that takes up a lot of learning and possibly doesn't lead with winning variations, here we play a gambit instead that would lead us to very good positions in the middle games and also lead us to very solid positions in the end games when white plays correctly. So we play e5 here. So let us look at the e3 variation in the first part of the series, and this first part will also serve as the introduction part of the series. So when black plays e5, white will capture the pawn, d takes pawn because it's a gambit. Now there are two ways to continue the variation here. One is to play knight g4 and try to attack the pawn on e5, try to regain the pawn on e5, or black could play something like in e4, where we try to control the center, having a strong outpost for the knight on e4, and a lot of attack could be induced afterwards. So it all depends on how black would want to continue here. So our idea is to control the center, since that's what we were talking about initially. So we would obviously go with knight e4. This is a pretty solid move. The variation is not too much to learn, but then it would give you very good positions in the middle games. I could assure you that. So if white continues with nf3, we would play in c6 by attacking the pawn. Here white is trying to create a defender to the pawn on e5, and we are trying to create one attacker to the pawn on e5. The pawn on e5 is a central thing that we need to recapture. Although it's not the main thing here, it could be definitely something that we need to have our eye on. So against nf3 we play in c6, and in this video guys we shall look into the e3 variation here. This is normally how white plays the Budapest Gambit. So when white plays e3, the main intention is to normally get the bishop on d3 and drive away the knight on e4, because the knight on e4 would create a lot of problems for white. So it's not really easy for white to drive away the knight on e4. So bishop to d3 is definitely a move that is to consider in the near future. So against e3, we could play something like d6. We would play something like d6 because obviously we are sacrificing another pawn. We would be a pawn down, but then we would also consider the tempo that we gain in the next few moves here, because let's have a look at the mobility of the pieces guys. White's mobility of pieces, it all looks cramped up, the pieces haven't come outside, and not really much going on for white here, to be honest. But then black, if white capture the pawns now with e takes d6, we would have a lot of advantage. We could play bishop takes d6, and then there's immediately followed by queen f6, bishop f5, castling on the queen side and putting pressure on the queen on d1. There's a lot going on guys, and that's what we shall be looking at in this video. So against d6, there are many variations here. One is the best move is for white to continue with bishop d3. This is the mainline variation, and that was the original intention of white playing e3 here. So after e3 we played d6, and now if white continued with bishop d3, we would play knight c5, and now if white captured the pawn on d6, we would capture it with the bishop. As I mentioned earlier, guys, it's the same idea that we have, bringing a queen here, playing bishop, developing the bishop, castling on the queen side and attacking on the king side with g5, h5, g4. That is, if white castles, we have a lot of attack coming on the king side, and it's not easy for white to defend the attack that is coming up very shortly. So after e takes d6, bishop takes d6. Now if white played castles, we are immediately winning this bishop now, because we could just capture the bishop. After queen captures the knight, we could play bishop takes h2 check. And however white captures this bishop, we are capturing the queen the next move. That is, after knight takes h2, we would just play queen takes d3. We are a solid queen up, and it's easily winning for black. I don't think any further analysis is required from here. Whereas if white did castle and actually looked at the bishop knight takes d3 followed by bishop takes h2 variation, if they did look into it, and if they played something else like bishop e2, for example, then we would go with our original plan of queen f6. We would play queen f6 followed by the ideas of g5, h5, bishop g4, castling on the queen side and putting pressure on the d file. We have a solid advantage here, guys. There's not much to discuss from here, but then you know the general idea and how to play on from here. So it's a very good position that is leading us into a solid middle game. So there's nothing to worry from here. You can have if white continues with castle, for example, we could just play bishop to g4, and if white played h3, we can play bishop takes f3, or even with h5 would also work here, because if white captured, we could capture. And if white played knight e1, it's pretty easy from here, guys. We could just play rook h1 check. After king h1, queen h4 check to king g1. That's the only move we can play. So basically it's a checkmate. It's not really easy for white to continue from here, considering the amount of attack that you're getting from black. And after queen f6, you basically know how the idea is. It is to play bishop g4, g5, h5. So let's look at the other variations, guys. So instead of after bishop d3, knight c5, if white didn't want to capture the pawn on d6, and if white played something like bishop e2 initially, then what would happen if white wanted to give away the pawn on e5, try to regain the control on the center? Well, there's two ways to continue. I shall explain both ways. One way is to continue with d takes pawn, and the problem with this move is, you should be seeing it right now. White would capture the queen on d8. We cannot capture the pawn on d8 with the knight, because this pawn would be hanging afterwards. So we would have to capture it with the king, and white would just castle here. And if we played any move like f6 to prevent the knight coming to g5, then what would happen is white would play rook d1 check, and black has to move the king. So black is basically losing two moves, bringing the king to d8 and then back to e8. So it's not an ideal situation for black. So I wouldn't consider playing d takes e5. So instead, what I recommend here is to play knight takes pawn. So after knight takes knight, we could capture it with the pawn, and this is how the variation would go. Now if white played castles, we could play c6, and after rook d1 check, we can play king c7. We can play king c7. Our king is pretty secure, and we have all the pieces and pawns under control, and the variation could go on like this. And white could play nc3. We can play g6. I shall explain the flow of the attack in this kind of variation as well, guys. Although it seems like it's an equal position, it's not going to be equal in the next few moves. We are going to get a slight advantage here. After nc3, we can play something like g6, b3, and now we can play bishop g7, bishop b2, we can play f5. After b4, we can play knight e6. If c5, which is the best possible continuations, we can obviously play something like rook d8 and try to exchange the rooks, leading us into an endgame with a slight advantage because of all of these pawns. And we could also play a5, trying to break the structure of c5 and b4. We can play a5, and if white captures, we can capture the pawn on c5. So we have a lot going on here, but then what I would recommend in this position is knight g5, guys. The reason is because we can play bishop e6 afterwards. This is the primary idea. And then knight f7. If the knight is driven away by something like h4, we can play knight f7. If white played h4, we would play knight f7 now. And if white played a3 to strengthen the structure, we can play bishop e6. And this is a good position for black to continue from here, because now we can play rook a d8, try to exchange the rooks, and it's an easy position for us to play from here, guys, because white doesn't have the opportunity of creating the outpost on d6, because black is now defending the square on d6 now. So this is how the position leads us to, guys. So we looked at the e3 variation. And this was the first part, the introduction of the series. I hope you liked the video. Thank you, guys.